at the level that they were really prepared to go to. And in fact, she says some students are not prepared to be in college at all. So they're basically, of course, using money, building debt and stuff that they're not going to be able to pay back because when they graduate, they're not really going to get a good job if they graduate. So that was an issue I just read about recently. Watched an hour-long video that she, a presentation she gave about the incident and everything. But that's different than like the incident that happened with Charles Murray at Middlebury, or what's her name? Catherine Wolfe, I think. Christina Hoff Sommers, sorry. Christina Hoff Sommers was booed at another campus where she gave a talk because she's a conservative speaker and so on. So there's a couple of incidences at various universities where conservative speakers were quashed by the audience, not letting them speak. But in the University of Pennsylvania situation, it was the faculty actually that banded together to write a letter to condemn one of their fellow colleagues for the kind of conservative things she said. And they were really actually going out of line themselves in condemning her, using peer pressure to keep her from saying what she felt was, was of course her opinion. I mean, you can still argue with her, but she wants data, not just condemnation, etc. So that's interesting. Speaking of which, today, welcome back, first day of spring, and we're looking at the big issue that I guess at least one student complained about. Sorry about that, but it's like philosophy. So, that's the topic again. And it's, let me quick check here, the page, where are we? March 20th, 179 to 181. So very short little section here. And in fact, when we look at the Timaeus, I think when I talked about the picture on this text, didn't I mention this picture one class? The School of Athens? Yes? The book, I had thought that the book that Plato was carrying was the Republic. I know I've even said that in class, but guess what? And it's hard to see, It's such small. Actually, if you blow up the picture, he's carrying the Timaeus, which is kind of interesting. So the Timaeus is kind of an interesting book. And as a dialogue, lots of different individuals discussing a topic. So the dialogues of Plato, they're literary pieces meant to be entertaining as well as informative. Right? And what we have here is Timaeus is the character that's basically relaying a story that was about Solon, who was one of the great Greeks from the past, who had traveled to Egypt and engaged the priesthood class of individuals in Egypt, doesn't say where, in the discussion about metaphysics and about the beginning of the universe. And what we end up with is a discussion about the Greeks. This is the story where part of it is about Atlantis. If you remember, Atlantis, I don't know if you've ever heard, might not be a myth, might be a real event, where there was supposed to be an island kingdom, was actually passed the Pillars of Hercules. Are you familiar? The the kind of the mouth of the Mediterranean going out into the Atlantic is referred to as the Pillars of Hercules. And the Egyptians are the ones that explained to the Greeks that the Mediterranean's not really a great sea, a great ocean. It's like a port compared to the real ocean that's out there. And if you think Egypt, where it's located, would at least know that they've got an ocean off to the right, the east, right, from Egypt, and know that the Mediterranean is just an inland bordered sea for the most part. But this nation, they say, was a great, powerful nation, Atlantis, and they were going to basically conquer all the people in the Mediterranean area, including the Egyptians, but it was the ancient Athenians that were the ones that defended everyone against them. And also then that there was a great cataclysm and the island sunk. So hence the myth or the story about Atlantis that many people still go looking for. Other people even try to figure out where it might have been. Some have argued that it was South America, actually, and that somehow that the one or the other of the ancient civilizations in South America had actually tried to invade the Mediterranean. Go figure. Kind of interesting. If you're familiar with Thor Heyerdahl, I think I said his name right. When I was a kid, he actually built rafts. The first one he did was the Kon-Tiki, and he built it in South America and sailed to the islands, I think it was Tahiti, to prove that you could sail a raft from South America to the islands in the middle of the Pacific. And he succeeded with no problems. I mean, it was, of course, he built a raft that was of the type that he thought the ancients could have built. That's kind of interesting. I remember reading the book as a kid and thinking how neat that would have been. Then later on, he built a raft in Egypt, which he sailed across the Atlantic to the Americas to prove that you could do that as well. And now we know that the ancient societies had all sorts of ocean-going craft that they used to sail all over. So we no longer think that men were basically stuck on one particular place. We know about the Vikings traveling. We know the Chinese traveled across. There's the Zuni Enigma. Have you ever heard of that? Apparently the Zuni tribe I think they're in Utah, have Japanese genes. So way back, Japanese monks, probably Zen monks, who were kicked out of Japan because of their theological disputes, ended up looking for the center of the earth. They were convinced that it was in Utah. And so like 100 or so monks from Japan fled to what eventually would become the European New World, and settled in a village in the middle of the desert. Well, it wasn't a desert then. And their genes and a lot of their cultural elements are still there. So that's kind of interesting. So there's a lot about prehistory, of course, that we don't know. And the Egyptians obviously were an ancient society. And they explain, by the way, to Solon why that is the case. They explain in the Timaeus, so it's kind of interesting in this too, that because they're on the Nile and all the flooding comes up instead of from on top, they've always been able to survive. So their society's never been washed out by a deluge. Whereas the Greeks, who are like along the coast, if the deluge comes from top down, they're always destroyed, right? So there's been lots of people being wiped out one way or another. The other way that people have been wiped out is by burning, from the top down. So, if you're, living on the mountaintops, then you're burned up, and it's only the people down below that survive. And they say that this happens periodically too. So the sun, every once in a while, will burn us up as it goes through its various cycles or whatever. So that's kind of interesting. That's all in the Timaeus, right? So this is Plato. So this is ancient stuff. So as a result of people being destroyed, wiped out periodically everywhere else except along the Nile, they end up with all the cultural history and the knowledge. Of course, thanks to Christianity destroying that knowledge base, we lost all of that too, as you are familiar, right? The Library of Alexandria was wiped out. So we're still finding stuff though, so that's pretty cool. Digging up graves and finding all sorts of information. Have you ever tried reading hieroglyphics? The various tombs and everything? You actually could read them now pretty well, I think, so. Most of that is because of the Rosetta Stone, right? So that's pretty neat. Okay. So, Egypt's priesthood class knows stuff that no one else does. And they start passing this on. Not only the cycles of destruction, which is news to other people, but something, by the way, that we can still think about as we have people talking about global warming and stuff. The other interesting argument, though, which seems very odd for us, and I think the easiest way to look at it is I don't know why they had this is in between America and Africa, and that's totally upside down and backwards. I don't know why that would be. There have been and will be again many destructions of mankind. Not everybody, but quite a few. So Critias is a follow-up dialogue to the Timaeus, and that's where the story of Atlantis is. But, so properties of the universe. First of all, the world is a living creature. So that's like Gaia, if you've ever heard of it, called Gaia. And the intelligence that created it. Now this is, I think, pretty significant here, and that is that for the Egyptians, the concept of the divine that created the universe cannot be part of the universe itself. If you think about it, of course, that's like Homer, duh, right? Is it? Does he say dough, right? Homer says dough. Do you still watch Homer? Is he?
Dow or something like that. I don't know. That sounded horrible.
Everyone still knows who Homer is. I mean, it's not the
Homer
poet.
Simpson? Oh, the poet.
It's Homer Simpson, yeah.
Yeah, he's still doing this now.
So I don't know if you still do that, or I don't know what.
It's still a thing.
I mean, I cursor through. No, not cursor. Channel surf through, and I see various cartoons, and I just not interested in any of them anymore. I don't know if that's something you experience. Do you ever watch TV?
No.
Anybody?
Watch episodes of particular shows that I keep track of.
So I probably shouldn't even watch TV anymore, right? It's dated. Yeah.
Dying business. That's why all the cable companies now do internet, because we've realized that everyone's just using Netflix, not using those services.
Interesting. Well, in any case, it makes absolute sense. There are some scientists, for example, Richard Dawkins, who, in arguing with Alistair McGrath over the concept of God, argues that if you can explain how the God that you believe in evolved from like a human of some kind and became powerful and learned, created weapons and stuff, and then became a powerful God, that's the kind of God he would believe in. The thing is, that's not at all what Alistair is talking about. That's not a God. That's just a powerful human being, or whatever, that develops technologies that beats the crap out of his neighbors, right? Which is history, right? But that's not what the Egyptians referred to as God, nor do the theologians ever refer to that as God. For them, God is the explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. And that means that it can't be part of the universe, because that would make it just another creature instead of the creator, right? So, as far as they're concerned, whatever it is, the demiurge has to be intelligence. It has to put intelligence in soul, and soul in body. But it itself has to be outside of the universe. So, by the way, everyone noticed that Stephen Hawking died last week?
Yes, rest in peace. The brain drain continues.
Well, there are other genie or geniuses, depending on the correct pluralization of genius. You're a genius.
If I have access to information.
Exactly. Great answer. Yeah. I mean, all of the past geniuses, information that made them a genius is accessible to you. So at least in the sense that they were geniuses, you're a genius. Yes?
Well, and more now it's the motivation to achieve something greater than their own base needs, which has become
Excellent.
kind of the mainstay.
You realize you're all Ubermensch, you're all geniuses, and your IQs are higher than mine, I'm sure. Yes?
Oh, I would also taught humility.
I'm the humblest person in this room, and proud of it, too.
My dad always likes to say.
But I love the competition, that's okay. Isn't that character a Homer character?
This is the Rick and Morty. This is Rick and Morty from the new show Rick and Morty. Kind of like what
Okay.
took over. More like adult comedy along the lines of like Seth. Was that Seth Green that did
Okay.
Futurama? Or
I think so.
It has a similar animation style, though, I can see that, but it's
It's
slightly different. It's different.
so highlighting the influence of the broken home that most lower middle class families herald from.
It's kind of a burn curve but
Yeah, I mean, just think about what if Hypnotoad was like actually not
basically
just
have a
Hypnotoad.
really high IQ to watch that show.
Yeah. At least one equal.
Well, I've mentioned the Flynn effect, right?
Not to my recollection.
I haven't? You've
No.
heard of the Flynn effect.
We've
The
heard of
Flint?
it from, psychology. So the Flynn effect. By the way, there's a new book out that I haven't read yet, but I just read about it in Steven Pinker's book.
I got a couple hours into that thing.
That yeah, you've got the audio version, which they say is 20 hours long.
Yeah.
But how do you even watch the graphs? I mean, they can't.
If I would before I purchased it, I probably would have looked at the book next time for something along that lines. So I'm sure I'm missing something.
Yeah. So, by the way, this is like a major read right now. If you're, I think I've mentioned it
before spring break that I just picked it up. It just came out. But Steven Pinker, you weren't here. I'm pretty sure, right? So, shoot. Should just go to enlightenment now.
I remember.
For you. So if you get the chance, this one.
You've
But-
mentioned a couple times now.
Yeah, that's really good. The point about the Flynn effect that he mentions is that it seems like it's maxed out. So I have to read that book to find out why. That at some point the IQ growth has like reached its maximum or something. Does that make sense?
They have, well, many think that the IQ just began rising because the comfort of living and also increased, and we had more nutrition, and so like, I'm gonna think. With
Same
one
as
thing,
height.
They noticed
Height
that
grows.
it helped when you had when they entered the Head Start program, which helped children in low-income families that were really young. It increased their IQ quite a bit, but by the time of sixth grade, it was about the same as everyone else's. So they believe that there isn't really much you can do except maybe a few vitamins here and there, and also just keeping an active mind.
That sounds right out of one of Flynn's books, actually. Does your family make you smarter? Was one of his books.
There was
I mean, that's blatantly, that's a yes. I mean, those habits, those rituals, those routines.
There was twins that were adopted off to different families, and the older they got, the closer their IQ and the closer their everything became, and they lived in two completely different families. So yeah, like it's amazing how our biology kind of.
Live in two different societies.
I have no idea.
Because I mean, if they lived in like suburban America, where you go to school and read books, usually.
You read books. It's urban
What do you
America. I didn't know that.
But it'd be different if you live in like the ghetto where nerds got beat up.
Nerds get beat up in the ghetto.
I think that's a thing.
God.
Reading books.
Yeah.
So he's fascinating himself. My favorite is besides health, besides good nutrition, besides a pure environment. In other words, not living in Beijing where the smog is so bad that you've got to walk around with a mask, which has got to mess with your whole health. And exercise, which is important because if you're healthy, it's better for your brain. But also all the exercise that we get by being attached to the internet constantly, by I mean, you're exercising your mind 24 hours a day, even while you're asleep. And a lot of people have devices on while they're asleep, and who knows what that does. I don't know if it hurts you or not, because you know if your mind is still active while you're asleep, gosh, what happens to the cycles that you're asleep?
I think our sleep cycles have been messed up for centuries.
Maybe not the circadian rhythm, but how we decompress and how readily we drop into REM sleep. Maybe, who knows? All I know is that very same thought has cost me a lot of sleep.
That's like stress, you know. One of the things that psychologists tell you is you shouldn't have too much stress. It's bad for you. And then you start worrying about whether or not you have too much stress. Of course, that's stressful itself, you know. So you start.
It's just stressing over whether you're stressing or not.
Exactly. I was worried because my dad had an ulcer and had part of his stomach removed, and his dad had had an ulcer and had part of his stomach removed, and in fact ended up to the rest of his life having an ulcer because the surgery didn't heal. So he
Oh, Lord.
so he was always walking around holding his stomach in, and so in college I would worry that I was worrying too much because they thought that you could get an ulcer from worrying too much. But then they discovered that it's bacteria and just take antibiotics. And in fact, I never ended up with an ulcer anyway.
Well,
So-
it also like correlated with like stress increases the chances of getting sick too. Like it pulls your entire body down, your entire immune system, your heart rate.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, according to
However, let's face it, your IQs are higher than mine because of age. I'm 67 almost. So, well, at least the younger folks in the class are just as cohort. You're supposed to have maybe a couple points or more.
You most likely have a higher crystallized IQ than everyone that would, I mean, like, well, depending on your other people's, yeah. I mean, anyone, all of you, everyone that isn't young probably has a higher crystallized IQ just because, I mean, and that's important.
Because of
too.
learning.
Yeah, and I know that.
Remember, though, after a certain point, you also have a forgetting.
Oh, yeah, there's a forgetting too.
However, it seems just logical that we can easily know that the creator of the universe had to be outside of the universe. So whatever your explanation for that is. And when we talk about Stephen Hawking, he might have changed the vocabulary, although even in the first book that he wrote that made him famous was A Brief History of Time. He does say towards the end of the book, the famous quote, that once we understand the grand unified theory, the physics theory that explains everything, we will know the mind of God. He uses that actual expression. Later in the book that I refer to more often than that, and that is the Grand Design, where he talks about relativity in the sense of model-dependent realism, right? The idea that we create these abstract models, which then we use in order to analyze our experience, our data, and we think of that as the way the world is. And it is that way, except that that's only one model. It's model-based. It's model-dependent realism, right? But you have to have the model in order for you to use those kinds of concepts, in order for you to have that kind of power over your universe, that you could predict things, because it's a conceptual schema working within a conceptual schema working within a conceptual schema that does border on actual experience, right? So that's one of the powerful things that thought and language enable us to have, is these conceptual schemas. But don't confuse the real universe with the model. That's the important thing. And remember, we can have multiple models, and each model can actually be useful for different things. So that's why it's important, and that's why it's relative. It doesn't mean that there isn't truth. It's just that truth is dependent on the context or the model that you're using for whatever it is, the purpose that you're doing, right? So Hawking is actually just changing the vocabulary, but still adopting all of the issues associated with the Egyptians in the Timaeus. But we could go back and look at some of the weird things that they come up with. So the creation of the world soul, if the divine creates the earth as a living thing, you have to think of the earth as having a soul, the world soul. But we also end up with the elements, and these are really fascinating, because these are mathematically based. So these are all of the, I can't go over any further, I guess. So there are 5 altogether. I think we only have 4 in the view here. There's a 5th one. Interesting thing about these are also referred to as the Platonic. Are they Platonic shapes? Platonic objects? I forget.
I know what you're talking
The reason they're so significant is because all of their sides are the same. So when you have, notice on this one, so it's the same with all 5 of them. All sides are the same. In fact, I don't think you can have more than that. Roger Penrose came up with a design that I think is still another one. And that was referred to as the Roger Penrose, whatever. Shapes. So, okay, so it's tiling. So I don't know, that's obviously somewhat different, but you can end up with these shapes basically having more sides than the 5 that Plato is famous for. But that's because this is in a curved space. Does that make sense?
It is in a what space?
Curved.
Ah,
But I mean, we have curved spaces now. Plato was thinking in what would event it wasn't Euclidean yet, because Euclid comes after Plato. But Euclidean space is basically the same as what Sir Isaac Newton thought of things as like space stretching out in 3 dimensions, so that you'd actually have straight lines. The Euclidean proposition 5 is the one that 2 lines that are parallel never meet, whereas in curved spaces they do, right? So there's just a difference there.
when you just throw a gravity well in there, and then you'd have them connect and.
They didn't
separate.
have that. They didn't have the concept yet. And that's a whole different kind of geometry as well. But so these shapes, the tetrahedron, and they're associated with fire, because each of them are thought that since they're, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. This one has fewer sides than this one, and yet this one you can see. You could see fire. They didn't think you could see air. In fact, I'm not sure what they thought air was. Because not water, obviously, but they could feel the wind. But like oxygen wasn't invented until when? It was pretty late. I mean, when they realized that, well, obviously you could strangle somebody, even in the ancient times. You couldn't put a plastic bag over their head, though, because you didn't have any plastic.
We're talking about how you could have killed someone back then.
Well, I mean, did they realize what they were doing was cutting off their air?
I would suspect they realized they were cutting off the air, but not the oxygen flow.
It's like they never really, you would never see people getting killed by being stuck in a vacuum previously.
But I mean, people would build houses without a chimney, and they'd have a fire in the house. Well, then they realized, hey, we need some way of letting the smoke out. But was it because they realized they needed a draft with oxygen coming in, et cetera? Did they know
What
that?
was the spirit getting mad at them for having?
People still die because they don't have enough oxygen in their houses here.
Oh, it's even worse. If you're LEED certified, you have to have an HRV, a recovery system that filters and removes stagnant internal air with basically an air exchange. Because the houses required by state statutes have to be so tight, basically, as far as vapors leaks go.
Well, so, I mean, our atmosphere is not just air. Well, yes,
It's not just oxygen.
but it's not. It's much more complex than just saying it's air. One particular kind of object. And water, so the cube is Earth, and the last one is ether. Where is ether? Why is ether not the other?
Dodecahedron from the Magic Telephone booth, right? It's 12-sided.
Also known as the quintessence, the fifth essence, which is not a cute little redhead.
No. Lilo,
That's the fifth element.
Yeah.
So
right?
much.
Lilo, Lilumina, Lectar, Balaminachak, Bastabat.
Why do you know the name?
It's a long story.
She said it like twice throughout the whole movie.
The one I remember is multipass.
Well, they took that straight from Harrison Ford and the blimp scene in Indiana Jones. That was definitely an homage.
No kidding.
Yeah. I think.
See, genius. So is this interesting?
What was
Um,
ether supposed to be? I know the theory of ether, but what is it meant to represent?
It's not down here. It's only, it's primarily there as an explanation for how the stars and the planets are kept in their circles.
For a little bit, they thought when light traveled, it didn't really travel in this reality, but it also traveled in another reality that they called ether. So that's. But
Oh
they
yeah, oh yeah. They
proving that by
didn't think it was a vacuum. Now it's not a vacuum either. It's bubbles. The universe is viewed as full of bubbles of what? Quarks, I suppose.
We're talking about dark matter or antimatter or what have you.
I have no clue what any of that is.
No one does.
None of the.
Theoretically, yeah.
It's the thing that light moves around and somehow we see it.
That's the part that we don't see it.
Yeah.
It's the whole, we can't see it, but we know there's something there because it has mass. But we,
Or we believe it does.
well, there's like, we explain it as basically we know there's X amount of mass, but like there should be this much mass, but then we take the actual mass, like we take it somehow, I don't actually know the exact, and it's significantly higher than what we think it is, and so our explanation is, it's dark, is the very basic form.
Dark energy is a random movement that's causing it so that gravity is just sucking us all in.
That's what,
Yeah, I think that's.
The Egyptians have no idea, and this seems like utter nonsense to us today. But I mean, talking about quarks and
What
string,
That seems like utter
string,
nonsense to them.
wiggling strings, that.
What was this exactly like? Was it just like really small, or was this like kind of like alchemic like representations?
Well, so these are the shapes that
Shapes.
those things are supposed to be.
Because we couldn't see,
Oh,
we could magnify them that much.
Obviously, that's not something that they could actually discover with devices. They didn't have microscopes. They're just using math.
okay. So they're just. That's interesting.
And it's all theoretical. The idea that they're these shapes is because these are the only shapes that mathematically have all the same size, but that are and that runs them out. That's why the Penrose shapes, I think, are interesting, because Penrose, of course, is a contemporary, a friend of Stephen Hawking, co-author, by the way, of The Brief History of Time. So that's kind of intriguing. And was actually one of Stephen Hawking's teachers. It's kind of interesting, too.
Pardon?
Pardon?
Who was one of Stephen Hawking?
Roger Penrose.
Oh, Mr.
Sir
Penrose.
Roger
Gotcha.
Penrose.
It would explain the Penrose process, where the Penrose mechanism goes into detailed explanation to black hole mechanics.
He has some small books out. I ordered one once from Amazon. And the one day I opened my door and it fell in to my house. The postman had put it inside the door. And so when I opened the door, thunk, it fell into the house. Yes. Yes.
That's smart.
It was a complete guide to all the laws of the universe.
Was it a massive tome, or was it?
The Road to Reality. It's like a pamphlet-sized thing.
Right.
Notice it's a complete, not the complete. So,
Just the number 42.
no, this is
That's all.
way
So
more.
what do you want to say?
The neat thing about this book is it has 4 different types of paragraphs. The one type of paragraph, and they're all identified with little faces. So, for example, a smiley face, that means anybody could read this paragraph. If the face is kind of like quizzical, you've got to know some math. If it's like, you've got to know a lot of math. And if like the hair is like, then you're, only specialists can read that paragraph. So it's kind of intriguing. But yeah, so he's pretty cool, and still alive, because he doesn't have what is it?
ALS.
ALS. Okay, so this is, so be familiar with this, because this is Earth, Air, Fire, Water. Not only will bands use this as their title, although that's just Earth, Air, Earth,
Fire, Water.
Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Earth, Wind, and Fire.
That's
But this is also believed to be the particles that make up everything. So it's their version of string theory, basically. But it also plays into psychology, and notice that will impact psychology and medical science all the way up to at least George Washington. Because George Washington, when he was ill after riding around Mount Vernon, long after he retired from being president, he ended up with probably pneumonia. And the way he was treated by the doctors, they were the best doctors of the day, is they bled him, took a pan of blood out of him.
They were still bloodletting
Yes.
in the 1800s?
Until like after the Civil War.
Jesus.
In most countries.
And there's still the theory that they basically had from this time, that your body is made up of 4 humors, and when you're healthy, they're in balance. And if you're ill, there's one or the other is out of balance. And one of the ways they thought they could bring you back into balance was taking some of your blood out, because that would bring them back into balance.
But why would it be an excess of blood? What if it was an excess of blood?
fever and flush.
Well, they thought by taking blood out that they were taking all of them out. So it's not like they were taking just the one that was in excess. They thought that by taking some out, they decreased the entire volume enough that they would bring it more into balance.
And on a small scale, you could rationalize maybe white blood cells, which they didn't know about, actually jump-starting their immunosuppression system, but in most cases, they were so far gone, they just died.
And yeah, and the doctor took a pan of blood out of Washington. The next day he came back and he was worse. And normally they wouldn't take more blood out, but because Washington was so important, he did. And he died the next day, probably of anemia.
It's kind of interesting
Lack of iron in the blood because
how
there's no oxygen.
Western medicine is like complete opposite of Eastern medicine, in which they believe like cured like, and in Eastern they believe the opposite, kind of like it was usually had to do with either the colors or maybe even the taste. Just simple little things that were like opposite they considered, which is I think was kind of interesting. Like there's a thing, like I think, like if something caused you to, if you had like a fever and a plant caused you to have a fever, they would have you tap that plant.
But if like you're studying Shakespeare, it's important to know that this was their belief, that you had the four humors. It's even some of the characters are based on this. So Fiery Hal has too much fire. Falstaff is full of hot air, basically. That's why he's fat and talks too much. Right?
So, okay, and Mercutio?
Mercutio would probably be fiery,
Yeah.
I would think of. In fact, he's lying because he's too hot, and so he's lying in the fountain when Tybalt comes out and wants to let off steam. That's what gets the fight started, right? So yeah, I think, and even he's mad, and fiery individuals tend to be mad.
Yep.
So your analyses of Shakespeare's characters, it's not like Shakespeare deliberately applied this. It was natural to do this. This was like their understanding of psychology to apply this. The other would be too much water. A perfect example of someone that has too much water in their system would be Hamlet's girlfriend in the castle at Elsinore. She's crying all the time. She's pale, and she ends up drowning at the end, right? What's her name? I can't think of her name.
I haven't freaking read that in that.
Shoot. I would normally know that, but you know what? I can't remember it at the moment. Too much earth. You have examples, Cassius and Caesar's, Cassius, he has that. And the problem with people that have too much earth is they're usually constipated. So they're not happy. They're kind of grumpy, miserable, kind of skinny kind of individuals, etc. So they have characters based on this. They really believed it, right? So when you're reading the literature of folks, even up to I don't know how much impact it had on literature up to, like, say, Edgar Allan Poe. What did Poe believe? I don't know if you could read this into the psychology of Poe's characters or not. But it's not really up until, the invention of the blood, or not the invention of the blood, but the discovery of of blood flow was, what's his name? Sorry, I'm losing my mind. But that was about the same time that they started believing that there was physical characteristics of good health. A materialist. One of the perfect examples of that was Dr. Mayern.
Ophelia.
Ophelia. Mm. His name is spelled differently in different places because he was Swiss, and when he left Switzerland, he was the chief physician for the King of France for a while. Big arguments over all of that, by the way, because the standard physicians were kicked out by his introduction. And they were, of course, politically motivated to get rid of him because they believed in the right prayers. If you were wounded by a sword, you needed to have the right religious ceremony over the sword in order to cure whatever was wrong with you. He thought you needed, like, fluids, not vitamins, obviously. Hadn't invented them yet,
Well,
but
they still use tinctures of different herbs and whatnot.
physical
Yeah.
chemicals.
Ointments.
So he was a physical kind of guy. That's all. And look at the dates.
Really modern.
1573, 1655. I mean, that's Descartes. Well, he ended up having to, once the king died, not his fault, hopefully, he fled to England, where he became the court physician for the king in England. And he was wealthy, and he had his own castle with a tower, and he was into all sorts of science. So in the tower, he had his own telescope and things of that sort. Telescopes were a new, interesting device. So they had those. So, and that's about the same time that the way the blood circulates was discovered.
Mainly because
Hobbes thought it was tubes full of air. So that's kind of,
Well, in a roundabout ways, right? Oxygenated blood.
so Aquinas, if we move on, it's of course quite a leap from Plato to Aquinas. We're looking at the scholastic period in the end of the Middle Ages when we switch to Aquinas. But here we have proofs, the 5 ways. So if you start talking about the various arguments for the existence of God, we don't actually have an argument in the Timaeus. It's assumed that if you're a logical person, it's obvious that the universe is here and something had to make it. So what was it? Well, they don't really know, but they do give you an introductory science. It gives us this kind of thing, the idea that the earth is alive, that it has a soul, and that it's intellectual in some way, and that you've got this hierarchy associated with things, that intellect is the highest, and that's why the divine is associated with intellect. By the way, that's also ties into the Platonic forms. So if you think about how Platonic science works, the forms are the ideas are the permanent shapes, basically, that do not change. So the order kind of transmutes the physical, corruptible material in order to match the beauties of those forms. So
That's all theoretical. I mean, the whole science is all theoretical. But that doesn't go away. That stays there. We still have people like Stephen Hawking trying to figure out if we learn the grand unified theory, the assumed theory that would be logical, mathematically succinct, beautiful, because of basically what your shirt says.
Yes, let's do things your way because. Oh wait, how are we
I mean,
doing?
you say the dumbest,
It's not accurate.
but what you mean is simplest,
Yes.
actually, right?
Yes.
Famously, Einstein referred to the truth must be simple and beautiful, but no simpler. As simple as possible, but no simpler. Of course, did Einstein really say that? We've got all sorts of quotes associated with Einstein.
I think along with being a sleep-depleted mathematical genius that was on the Manhattan Project, he was like a quote machine. He was just always trying to make these little quips to keep, stay in the forefront of your mind.
So this is one of the famous ones.
There's only two things infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not so sure about the latter, or the former.
The former, yeah. However, but so Aquinas is going to give us an example of a different kind of argument. Instead of just arguing that the nature of God by itself is proof that God must exist, or that the universe existing must mean that there is a creator, instead uses what are called the five ways. And this gives us the cosmological argument. Remember, before we talked about the ontological argument, which is the argument from the nature of God himself. But the cosmological argument is based on the cosmos. We look at the cosmos, and from what we see, we can conclude that there must be a God. But there's four different cosmological arguments specifically. But they're all basically the same thing, that we have cause and effect relationships. So there are things that happen, for example, move. Things move. How did they move? Apparently the belief was that nothing would move unless it was moved by something else that was already moving. And that thing must be moved in turn. And that must be moved in turn, and so on and so on. But, and here's, I guess, the mathematical crux of this, that if, so this is the arrow of time. That's kind of an interesting, time flies like an arrow, but other things flop like a balloon. I don't know. There's, So if we're thinking about the past here, if there is not a beginning, then time's arrow actually goes this way as well, in which case we could never have gotten here, because we would still be going in that direction. So there has to be a beginning point. Past that, there is no motion, right? Well then, so how did the first thing get moved? Well, it had to be God, because it wasn't moved by something else.
So that means it would be cyclical then, right?
It's a terrible argument,
Yeah.
right? Do you agree? Well, at some point, something had to start the motion that wasn't moved itself. Well, I mean, when your alarm goes off in the morning, you don't think of your alarm as moving you, but you wake up and you get up without having been moved by something else.
how is that not a counterexample to this argument that everything that moves has to have been moved by something before?
You could use cause and effect on God too, I guess. See what happens.
And yeah, you could also say, well, but I can't conceive of God not being moved. I mean, if God is the first mover, the prime mover,
Then what moved him?
what moved God? Exactly. Can't we ask that? Why is that not at least as logical as the argument that, well, you can't imagine time being now if there wasn't an actual start?
I think of God as it's kind of like isn't based on reason. Like if there is no reason why there is God, it's just there, and so it's
Well,
I mean, this world, this universe is based on reason. Though everything's, I push something, it moves.
Plato says it doesn't even have to be an argument. It's the fact that we can't prove it either way.
Oh, yeah.
So it must be true. He's like the cup half full kind of guy.
These are also associated with the four causes, the four arguments. The fifth way, which, of course, we have the 5 ways. The fifth way is the teleological argument. I don't know what I did with my magic marker. What was this one? So the cosmological. So we look at the motion, which is the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause. But the final cause is actually the teleological argument. Which is also referred to as the design, the argument from design. So if you've ever heard the argument that the world is absolutely gorgeous, it's beautiful, everything works just amazingly, whatever, must have been a great architect that designed it, right? Couldn't have just happened by accident. And Darwin, of course, is the one that gets involved in that whole process, right? But so the telos is purpose or design in Greek. So this is the argument from design. Cosmos, of course, is the argument from the cosmos, the universe. Universe is Latin, cosmos is Greek, so we're just using English as synonymity in order to take our Latin roots and our Greek roots and say, oh, cosmos is universe. Uni, one, verse, side, verso, adverso, the other side. It's not my fault. But if you study foreign languages too much, your mind will go, so there. So today our topic was the kind of topic that would have gotten me in trouble, might still get me in trouble with one particular person who would like our topics to be smaller.
There's
No.
I was like, it's simplified,
But it's kind of an important philosophical topic. 'Cause
Why is it?
that's a good question. Why is it?
Because there's wisdom in knowing God, I guess.
well, I mean, you got labeling the unexplainable or the improvable or the improbable.
Well, I mean, if you think physicists are curious enough to try to figure out the grand unified theory, right? GUT.
Would be like Common Core, finding a way for everybody to function in a
It's-
harmonious
isn't it-
fashion.
Isn't it also a TV show?
Grand Unified Theory
It's also
or Common Core.
There's a TV show where there's like a bunch of nerds.
That's
Big Bang Theory.
That's,
Big Bang Theory, okay, sorry.
Which is a terrible show.
that's
I've never watched it. I think I've seen like little clips of it. But so the Grand Unified Theory. So, I mean, I think what motivates this is the same theological motivation. To understand why the universe is here. And it definitely has an impact on practical things, because based on success in these kinds of studies, you end up with people discovering things that actually end up working in practice. So, computers, understanding how the sun works, creating new kinds of transportation, medicines, transforming genetics so that you can have better crops. I mean, it has what you might call the trickle-down effect, I guess, on all sorts of other aspects.
there's also quantum computers that are coming out from, like, I'm not sure how exactly but I think like they're based off of theory, and then we didn't really quite prove the theory, but we're using the mathematics behind it to build computers.
And
To build the model for the computers.
Yeah.
today we have
There's a few out there that's
the best healthcare, the best devices. I mean, if you figure out how much the kitchen devices you have in your house save labor, and people have actually figured this out. So your average maintenance time working in the house today might be 2 hours a day. Do you even do that? Yeah. Used to be like the whole day. Somebody had to be like working in the house the whole day for all of the things, like washing the clothes. There's an interesting comment that the person who invented the washing machine should have had a statue and been worshipped by people for being, one of the greatest scientists ever, because of how much time that person has saved. Washing clothes. Washing clothes used to be like one of the main jobs for a lot of people every day, just to keep people dressed properly. Now you just throw your load into the washer, throw it into the dryer. I'm just thinking about that, and but if you figure the food that we eat here, none of it grows here. I mean, that you go to the Carr's supermarket and buy, I guess, right? Everything comes from somewhere else, so it's transported by. I mean, what's the guy whose name is C.K., the comedian?
C.K. Lewis.
C.K. Lewis?
Oh, a lot of his stuff's NSFW.
I don't know.
Louis C.K.
Is that him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
the link above it, and then that.
This one?
Yeah, don't from that, and then donating your body to science. It's kind of messed up.
All you're gonna find is stuff about the sexual allegations.
And donating your body to science. Quotations.
It's a lot of trust back then, yeah. Those were simpler times, I think. I just feel like we may be going back to that, by the way. But in a way, good, because when I read things like the foundations of capitalism are shattering, I'm like, maybe we need that. Maybe we need some time where we're walking around with a donkey with pots playing on the sides.
You think that would just bring us back to reality?
Yeah, because everything is amazing right now, and nobody's happy. Like, in my lifetime, the changes in the world have been incredible. When I was a kid, we had a rotary phone. We had a phone that you had to stand next to, and you had to dial it.
Yes.
You realize how primitive, you're making sparks in a phone, and you actually would hate people with zeros in their numbers, because it was more, it's like, oh, this guy's got 2 zeros, screw that guy, why do I want to... And then if they called and you weren't home, the phone would just ring lonely by itself. And then if you wanted money, you had to go in the bank for when it was open for like 3 hours. You had to stand in line, write yourself a check like an idiot. And then when you ran out of money, you just go, well, I can't do any more things now. I can't do any more things.
That's it, yeah.
That was it. And even if you had a credit card, the guy would go, oh, and he'd bring out this whole shunk, and he'd write, oh, you had to call the president to see if you had any money. And
It's all true, kids. You had to call the president, yeah. It was ridiculous.
Yes.
Do you feel that we now, in the 21st century, we take technology for granted?
Well, yeah,
Quiz
now
question.
we live in an amazing,
Is this the
amazing
best
world.
time
It's
to live
based on the
ever
crappiest
on the face of the
generation
earth?
of just spoiled idiots that don't care, because this is what people are like now. They got their phone and they're like,
Do you mean the
Ugh.
best time period,
It
or
won't-
do you mean the best
give it a
that's happened?
second. It's going
Well,
to
hopefully the
space.
future will be even better.
You give it a second to get back from space.
I hope so.
It's the speed of light.
I mean, I hope I will find that out myself, actually.
I was on an airplane and there was internet, high-speed
This is-
internet on the airplane. That's
Yes.
the newest thing that I know exists. And I'm sitting on the plane and they go, open up your laptop, you can go on the internet. And it's fast and I'm watching YouTube clips. I'm in an airplane. And then it breaks down. And they apologize, the internet's not working. The guy next to me goes, this is bull.
Same-sex. I think I saw this live.
Like, how quickly the world owes him something he knew existed only 10 seconds ago. And on planes, flying is the worst one, because people come back from flights and they tell you their story. And it's like a horror story. They act like their flight was like a cattle car in the 40s in Germany. That's how bad they make it sound.
Right.
They're like, it was the worst day of my life. First of all, we didn't board for 20 minutes. And then we get on the plane, and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. We had to sit there. Oh, really? What happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly like a bird? Did you partake in the miracle of human flight, you non-contributing zero? That you got to fly? You're flying! It's amazing! Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, oh my God! Wow! You're flying. You're sitting in a chair in the sky.
Yes. Now, Lily,
So yeah, is this the best time ever? So far. You could put the so far in there. No? Last year was better?
No, last year was worse.
Last year was worse.
Well, no, that was worse than last year, I guess. Like this second in time, worse than last year.
Ah, well, what I'm thinking is with all the devices,
Large scale. With all the what?
with all the devices that we have, like
The age range.
I mean, like cars. I mean, if you're in a car now and you're lost in a city, you've got an old car.
I feel like it's complicated shit more than it needs to.
That's true. That's true. A lot of stuff is way more complex than ever.
Yeah.
You need to have your son or daughter help you load your program on the computer. You know, us old people, like the father that told his teenage son, "We bought a software program that will enable us to control what you watch on the internet.
You set it up for me?
Can you set it up for me?"
You flip the switch on them, then you like have control of what you watch now. Yeah. And with the age of social media, everything
Yeah, all these folks that are criticizing like Facebook because of, well, I mean, a lot of it was because of the data that was being mined by that company, Oxford, whatever.
It's free, you are the service, you are the product.
I mean, you're the one that decides what you want to put on there. And I'm gladly putting pictures of my food, on there, for people, that are, why would you be interested in what I ate yesterday, But if you are, there it is. I'll share it with you, in 360. That's not just the pic, because my camera only does 360,
Only.
Yeah, I posted a picture of the pie I had on Pie Day. Because, everybody celebrated Pie Day, right?
We always get 3 pies. 3 pies on Pie Day. We get apple, pecan, and some form of chocolate.
Now, granted, it's cheesecake,
Because it's best.
How could you?
but they didn't have pie. So I insisted that they give me a piece of cheesecake, but call it cheese pie. That was my cheese
Just
pie.
had a pizza pie.
Oh, he is really. That typo's been bothering me.
It's not a typo.
That doesn't. No, it is, but it's supposed to be he has.
What's risen?
The church
Yeah,
over
he.
there has a "He is risen" sign for Easter.
Oh,
It's supposed to be past tense.
could be she is risen.
She has.
What if it's his name is risen?
Okay, then why doesn't it
Has risen. Okay, you got me. I mean,
How
it's
can
not
you
using
see-
capitalized, so I can't
How
really
can
tell.
you see signs from that far? Oh, I see, it's the post